Thank you, Ambassador Orizio. We've heard about the values that OSCE stands for from Vladivostok to Canada. We are now going to see how these values are in crisis or maintained by our keynote speakers, Professor Ian Manners, who I'll briefly introduce. It's our great pleasure to welcome Professor Manners, who is teaching at the Department of Political Science at University of Copenhagen. But for most of you from academic sphere, you probably know that he is the one behind the normative approach, power approach in European studies. His text, Normative Power Europe, A Contradiction in Terms, was voted by the Association of European Union Studies as one of the 5 most important ever texts on European studies in 2007. And it has been massively quoted in peer-reviewed journals and publications. So this concept in current moment is even more interesting to discuss. But Professor Manners is not only interested in normative aspects of EU, he has great interest also in symbols and popular culture, and is currently doing a research on symbols behind the EU integration, those that stick and people identify with, and those that are not that successful. Also theory of European integration, but also hands-on things like the issues Ambassador mentioned, public administration, global public governance, and one topic that will be one of the main themes of this year's Belgrade Security Forum, and that's climate change, but also processes that are more and more in question, both in Europe and globally, such as the issue of solidarity. If you look just at his few of his last titles, you'll see that although he's an academic, he actually deals with very burning issues. As I've mentioned, transnational solidarity as a concept and challenges, the security of identity or ontological security, symbolism, and then foreign policies of EU and how to research EU. How can we actually come to the good, credible research on such a complex animal as EU. Professor Manners is also teaching, so not just researching, and he has been author or contributor to the major textbooks on EU studies, but today he's going to address the topic of the ramifications or consequences of the retreat of liberalism for the EU and its normative power. So without further ado, I'll call Professor Manners, and just before that, one protocol announcement. When we finish with keynote speech, there is going to be a question time, and when that finishes, we don't have a break. So I'll just ask you to stay in the seats because immediately the first panel will follow on. Thank you. Professor Manners, the floor is yours.
Great. Super. Thanks very much. Good. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a delight to be here at the Belgrade Security Forum. I'm going to talk about the question of liberalism and its retreat, the question of the European Union, its normative power, but I'm also going to talk about what this means in international terms, in terms of international competition, international community, and what this means for understanding international security as well as European security. I'm going to question all of these concepts. I think it's extremely important we start by questioning these concepts. In particular, what do we mean by liberalism? In particular, what do we mean by the EU? Is it in crisis? What do we mean by crisis? What do we mean by normative power? I question myself. What do I mean? What do we mean by international community? What do we mean by international security? And I'm going to wrap it all together in a concept which I call planetary politics. What do we mean by politics as if the whole planet mattered? And I'll explain why I think that's important. So let me just start. There's an assumption that liberalism has been dominant over the past 70 years. And certainly when we look at the patterns of freedom and decreasing freedom in both democracies, non-democracies, and illiberal democracies, this is a very real issue for our age. But I raise the question of, is liberalism actually in retreat, and what do we mean by liberalism? And maybe it's not worth defending in its current ideological form. And I'm going to use something called empirical evidence to illustrate this. The Freedom House surveys attempt to judge how free the world is becoming or not. And for the last 13 years, they've systematically argued that the world is becoming less and less free. A loss of democracy, a loss of freedom of speech, a loss of human rights, a loss of political rights. And so we call that part of the decline of liberalism. But it's possibly not the most important component. The most important component is that countries that were not just partially or wholly illiberal, but also democracies have elected what I suppose you would call autocrats, whether it's in the European Union, whether it's in North America, whether it's in South America, whether it's in South Asia. These two components, the loss of freedoms and the election or appointment of nationalist hard-right leaders, are what constitutes, I think, today, for me, the decline of liberalism. But I think there's another decline, and one that, quite frankly, we don't like to talk about because it's a little embarrassing and we sort of wrap them together. That if liberalism was at its high point in the 1990s also ushered in worldwide a form of liberalism which I think infects and actually undermines the liberal order today, and that is neoliberalism. I define neoliberalism as the privatization of public life. And whether you're in the EU, in the US, or actually in a non-democracy, neoliberalism is rampant. So to answer the question, is liberalism in retreat? Yes, in its purest sense, the idea of freedom, of democracy, but in the sense that it's freedoms of market, it's the dominant portrayal and behavior of corporate activity, both within and without democracy, neoliberalism continues happily on its way. If we take this illustration from the World Inequality database, the past 30 to 40 years, if not longer, have seen a steady increase in inequality throughout the world. A marker, if there is any marker, of the onward march of neoliberalism, irrespective of whether democracy or non-democracy, freedom or lack of freedom is present within the societies where we see this march take place. And it is most noticeable, interestingly, in those countries which we now call emerging or essentially global powers, China and India. Yes, they've been successful at reducing the amount of poverty across the world. Yes, they've been successful in ramping up and dramatically increasing the amount of inequality across the world. So to answer the question, is liberalism in retreat? In its purest sense, yes, but in the sense of the idea of a dominant ideology not being liberalism but being neoliberalism, that is not true. But that has significant consequences for ways in which we consider the question, where does the EU stand within that story? Should the EU be an important actor in this 21st century world? Now, I think most of us in this room, I would hope most of us in this room, think the EU should be some sort of actor. But what sort of actor? Can we assume that the EU is still important? And pretty much every conference I go to is exactly the same. The EU has multiple crises, and it's in retreat, just like liberalism itself. That the EU should be shifted, changed, or, of course, if you're in the UK, demolished and removed in its current form to let way for, well, you know, basically the explosion of shock capitalism in the UK. Even more neoliberalism. Let's just question some of that using, again, empirical evidence. This then from the Eurobarometer survey of public opinion, and I'm using two sorts of public opinion surveys, Eurobarometer and in later slides the Pew Global Survey. This suggests that there has been a decline in trust across the EU over the past 10 years, but we're more or less back at the same place as we were in the year 2004. Well, I say more or less, the EU, trust in the EU has returned, broadly speaking, and bearing in mind trust in the UK and the EU is more or less zero right now in almost single points, and this is still in the aggregate data. But what has not returned to the same extent is trust in government. And these two are intricately linked, and it's worth bearing that in mind. Okay. So we've seen a return in trust in the EU, and for the first time ever in the data, and the data goes back to 1973, we've seen more EU citizens agree that they have some sort of voice in the EU than they do outside, or that somebody's actually listening to the EU. This is what I like to call the Brexit antidote. Thanks very much, Britain, for giving up your life. The rest of us are going to try and make a success of the EU. So is the EU in crisis? Yes, certainly it's in crisis. Every single form of government, whether liberal or illiberal, democratic or autocratic, is in crisis, partially because of the effects of neoliberalism within this broader context of liberalism itself. Again, some sort of illustration on this comes from inequality measures. Germany and France have broadly retained and continue to advance greater equality within the EU. The UK remains one of the most unequal countries in the EU. You want an explanation for Brexit? I give you an answer for Brexit. If you continue to be incredibly unequal, your government will never be able to respond to the demands of the average citizen, irrespective of which country you're in. Data from the OECD demonstrates this again. The red bar at the top is the United Kingdom, continues to be unequal. This doesn't really capture the picture because it's income, and most value and wealth is held offshore as capital, not income. So you could probably add an extra zero to that. Most of the wealth of the UK, of course, is not in the UK. So is the EU in crisis? Yes, the EU has been in crisis, and it continues to be in a crisis. It's not a crisis of democracy. It's not really a crisis of migration per se, or even Eurozone financial crisis. It may be a crisis of enlargement. It may be a crisis of meaning, but it sows the seed of its own crisis by continuing to perpetuate inequality within the notion, within the context of neoliberalism. Third question, then, related to that, is what does this mean for the EU in the world? What does this mean in particular for traditional notions of power? What does this mean for me and my interest in the idea of normative power, the ability to shape and define normal? Okay? Now, most people say, well, you can't differentiate between those, and I agree. Can we assume that normative power is a kind of traditional power projection? Mentions were made to the OSCE as a soft power, the US Coca-Colonization as soft power. Yeah? These all seem to be the same sort of thing, but with slightly different titles. And the past 20 to 30 years of EU power projection studies have basically been trying to count how many fairies you can find on the head of a pin. This was a defining moment in the Renaissance, by the way. What is traditional power, and thus what isn't traditional power? This is important because if the EU is emerging out of crisis, and I suspect this is the case, particularly with the departure of the UK, what should the EU be doing within the context of the supposed retreat of liberalism and the advance of neoliberalism? This is the Pew survey. It asks a few simple questions. These include which country is the world's leading power? Happy to see that the EU is treated as a country in this survey. Odd, but never mind. Most recent reports suggest around the world that the US is an important actor, particularly if you're Canadian. But many countries, and my favorite respondents here from India, by the way. In future, I think I'll just do all my survey work in India, so it's a pretty clear-eyed view of what the world looks like. Don't think the US is powerful at all. Interestingly. Actually, they think that China is even less powerful. But interestingly, and maybe this is the post-colonial heritage of Indian life, the EU is still considered, in traditional power terms, a leading economic power. And so we start to question this motif, this story of crisis of the EU, both within Europe and without Europe, okay? The reason these don't add up, by the way, all these numbers, is they forgot to ask the question, is India the most powerful economic country in the world? It's a shame, but never mind, perhaps they'll get their survey right next time. What EU citizens do want and do identify with the EU and the EU in the world isn't economic power, interestingly. Okay? Does the EU provide and promote prosperity? Yes and no, a little bit mixed, okay, but generally positive. But what EU citizens do want and have woken up to since 2016 is one very, very, very simple answer. They want peace. Okay. Now, we can argue what peace means and can you separate peace and solidarity and democracy from that equation. But for me, normative power, in any sense, whether it's physical projection, whether it's the imposition of power politics, is really about the promotion and processes of peace attainment. Okay? And so, reflecting on Sonia's introduction, thank you very much, I have a few images that capture this. It's quite clear that if you are trying to promote peace, you need to understand that prosperity and peace alone will never capture the necessity of ordinary people in their ordinary lives and their desires for peace. There has to be a third component, and it is the idea, in particular, of solidarity. Solidarity in the history of the EU, solidarity in its practice, and solidarity in its external relations. What do I mean by solidarity? Do I mean that we're all in the club of the EU together so that we can become more peaceful and more prosperous and more solid? No. Solidarity only works when it includes, and the word is inclusive, everyone. Okay, now this is a tremendous dilemma, right? Do you mean to say that the purpose of the EU should be to weaken itself? Not necessarily. Let's go back to a definition of normative power, the ability to define normal. But power doesn't mean forcing other people to do what you want. That's violence, as Hannah Arendt would have had it. Power means the ability to share something together. If any of you are in a relationship or in a family or have any relatives, and I'm saying it that way because I know you all do, you understand that the powerful relationship between you and your family and your relatives and your neighbors and your society and your community and the wider world is far more important than the use of violence. It's an essential component of peace. So when I say normative power, I don't mean the ability for A to get B to do what it wants. And of course, A is always America and B is always Brazil or Bolivia or Bosnia, right? I mean the act of solidarity, the act of sharing, okay? Here. And in real terms, if the EU is good at doing anything, and it should be good at doing something, it is stretching the idea of solidarity from the I and the us to the we and the them. Now, the migration issue is a crucial example of how this can work and how this has failed. When I get to my sixth set of slides and talk about the environment, I'll tell you why precisely. But EU foreign policy creating a continent of solidarity by paying the Turks not to allow any migrants isn't actually normative power. I'm really sorry about that. And as has been demonstrated quite ably over the last 7 days, it's never, ever, ever going to work, right? Because it will be used as a form of, how should we say, extortion. But the second image is far more important. Millions and millions of Europeans, including myself and the people that live in Northern Europe, did everything we could and do everything we can to help migrants because we know they're never, ever, ever going to stop. Okay? So you can sweep them away, you can kill them in the Mediterranean, you can shoot them with gunboats, but you have to address the bigger, wider challenge, and that only works at the global level. Let's go to the global level. Should that international community, that global level, be one characterized by a notion of the international society of states, or one characterized by global competition? And if we are stood at the midpoint between the 20th century, the hegemony of international society, of the international community, witnessed by the UN, and the onset of global competition between, well, if you're doing Chinese foreign policy, 5 great powers, superpowers, and see where the language is taken from, the US, China, India, US and that other one, what should we call it, the EU or whatever, you know. And of course, if you're Pakistan, or if you're Brazil, or if you're South Africa, or if you're Japan, you're sat there going, that doesn't work. Yeah. This whole idea of global competition, borrowed from the language of Western imperialism, is utterly contradictory and absolutely bound to end in total catastrophe this century. We'll go through why that might be. There is still, and there remains, a high degree of trust across the world, even in, according to the Pew survey, so-called right, far-right populist parties and their governments. There is still a high degree of trust. About 2/3 of people across the world support membership and the activities of the UN. In that sense, the international community retains intact. Actually, one of the lowest levels of support for the UN is in the country that hosts its headquarters and retain power. 36%, that's half of the global average, is Republicans in the United States. So if you want to look for the collapse of the international community, there's only one place to look, and it's in something called the West Wing, all right? But if you look at the broader survey, if you look at the broader data, again taken from the Pew survey, international community remains the only game in town. Okay? Why is that important? And how do we then reset this question of what liberalism means, what the EU is and should be, how it should project power, and what this means by the international community? My last two sets of slides make two moves. One, they ask you to think again about what security means. Two, they ask you to think again of what security means to whom. One is, how do we feel? How do we understand security? Two is, who is the we in that understanding, that feeling? So the first move is to think, not in terms of security is what people tell us it is, or if you're in the Copenhagen school, security is a speech act. That is, somebody who's got the mic grabs it and says, quick, terrorist, quick, national threat, quick, evil person. Yeah, you're either for us or against us, as they say in Star Wars. And in the President of the United States, of course. We need to rethink what national security, regional security, and international security are, because they suffer from very, very similar problems. Other people define them for us. We define them for the rest of the people here in Belgrade and Serbia. And they have very, very different understandings of what security means. I want to use this through three sets of data taken from the Eurobarometer survey. Again, it's only for the EU, so I apologize for that. A question always asked is, what is your major concern, your major issue? And I interpret this as, what's the thing that kind of scares you? And over the last 10 years, the thing that scared everyone has been immigration and terrorism. Okay? And so the focus has been on that at the EU level. But by focusing on these aspects, we've really missed some other important questions. And although we've asked the question, we have the data, we've never thought about it, at least within the EU in policy terms, or we've always left it to member states to deal with. But in a neoliberal international order, you cannot leave it to member states to deal with, because they're either unable to, or in the case of the UK, unwilling to do so. Okay? So the second piece of data is what concerns you within your member state. And interesting, the responses to this are so different, and yet we never hear them adequately dealt with at the EU level, and I would argue also at the member state level. Unemployment, stupid. What's the question? Okay? And today, the major question, thanks to Greta and her friends around the world, is climate change. Okay? My second set of slides after this one, I'll come specifically and finish on that point. But if you ask people, diagram at the bottom, what do they feel personally? You often get really different results. And most people dismiss this. Indeed, I had to find this data elsewhere because it wasn't in the survey results from Eurobarometer for this year. What is it that concerns you? Lifestyle, economy, pensions, cost of living. Yeah? Very real problems that are systematically exaggerated by the unseen, the practice of the privatization of public life. So, if we want to genuinely address all types of security issues at the same time, we have to think all the time in these three different ways. What is it that makes you feel ontologically insecure? What makes you worried in your daily life? Because I tell you, there is a party in every government, in every country across the EU that has a simple answer. You feel ontologically insecure? I've got a solution for you, okay? We're going to go back to the good old days. We're going to make our country great again. And if we don't see this, if we don't address this, and increasingly there are fewer and fewer parties on the left that even are willing to address these genuine concerns, then we are inviting rampant populism to serve the aims of neoliberalism. My last slides are why does this matter beyond this room? Who is the us? I call this, we need to think about liberalism and neoliberalism. We need to think about the EU. We need to think about the EU's projection of power. And we need to think about who is it for and who does it not help. Not just within a European sense, but in a planetary sense. And no, planet isn't some sort of synonym for global or world or international. Planet means thinking holistically about all these questions in one time. And I appreciate this is impossibly difficult. Okay? Now, we all know from the Paris goals that we need to halve our outputs of CO2 by the year 2030. Yeah? And if we can do this, we can avoid a devastating 1.5% increase in mean surface air temperature. And the report that came out last year set out why this is so important, and this is why our children are marching around the world to prevent this from happening, okay? And good luck to them, basically, because as you can quite clearly see from the first diagram, there's absolutely no chance of this being prevented whatsoever, okay? It is almost inevitable we will hit 3 to 4%. Now, if you travel across the fields and the streets of Serbia, as I did yesterday, you will notice the harvest being taken in and the crops being burnt off. I thought it was a bit odd in October, given that it's going to be, 28 degrees today? That's because every 4 years we lose a day in seasonal change. So in 40 years we will lose 10 days. And within the lifetime of our children, by the end of this century, both sets of seasons will retreat at almost 2 months, leaving no winter, which means systematic flooding across Serbia, forest fires across the remaining Serbian forests, the complete loss of snow cover and skiing across Serbia, and extreme weather events on the Danube, which should normally occur every 100 years, to occur every year. Okay, now, I don't know if that's bad news for you, but it is now guaranteed, okay? Because we've already hit 1.5% on land temperatures. And these aren't straight lines. These are non-linear curves that are accelerating, okay? Why does this matter? Well, because the inevitability of these changes in these systematic extreme level events are exactly what drives the crisis in our economies, our society, the loss of food security, the migration patterns that we witnessed during the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, which were caused by displeasure amongst Arab countries at the failure of crops and the failure of their government to adequately deal with food insecurity, particularly in the cases of Tunisia and in the case of Syria. And this will occur every single year. And our own populations will raise these sorts of concerns. In Sweden, we have forest fires regularly burning above the Arctic Circle. Well, that's impossible, right? Or it's not supposed to happen until the year 2100. It's happening today. Because projections that were made 10 years ago to occur by the year 2100 occur today. Flooding, dehydration, loss of crops in the south, forest fires in the north, sea level rise, perpetual flooding are already occurring. Sorry, Serbia's not in here. I'll project them for you. Oh, I already did. Okay. So we must put all these together to think holistically about the liberal order and about what it is that drives it to become more neoliberal. Because it is precisely these neoliberal elements that are most resistant and systematically seed false news stories in the media that undermine democracy, that challenge and introduce crisis in the EU, and that drive problems in the EU and its relations with the rest of the world, undermine the security, ontological security of citizens within and without Europe, and place us in the position where today we must put all these things together in what I call planetary politics. Thank you very much. Any questions? Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Ambassador of Ukraine here in Belgrade. Thank you very much for the fascinating speech. You mentioned that liberalism today is being ousted by neoliberalism, and you had mentioned at the beginning that neoliberalism means privatization of public life. Could you please give more details about it? Because it's the essence of your story, but it's, I guess, more details are needed.
Sure, sure.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let me do that twice. Let me do it first on how I enjoyed this first in the early 80s. I lived in a country called Britain, which was sold in the early 80s and replaced by an autocracy of kleptomaniacs who systematically stole everything and then made it not work, including all public utilities, all public services, all forms of public transportation, all forms of public building, public parks. Why does this matter today that, you know, some slightly mad, rusty lady came to power in 1979 and was part with Ronald Reagan? By the way, I fled the UK to move to the US because I thought it'd be safer there. Why does it matter today that these ideas became dominant? Okay, because didn't they lead to the end of the Cold War? You know, didn't poor old Gorbachev want some hamburgers, so he decided to end the Cold War or something like that. I always get the story wrong. Because today, these types of practices undermine democracy, and they actually seed both populism and extremist forms of oligarchic kleptomania. Okay? And when I say oligarchic, I don't just mean Russia or the Ukraine. I also mean the US and the UK. There are very tight bonds, interestingly, between offshore corporate activities, climate change denial, populism. Every single member of the cabinet in the UK today is a climate change denier and advocates leaving most major climate change negotiations. There are very strong bonds between these challenges, and I think it's the current position of major corporate, transnational corporate activity, particularly petrochemical industry, to challenge, undermine, avoid, displace the right questions and the science that has led us where we are in the challenge of populism. You know, the Brexit Party is a climate change denial party fed by money, influence, fake think tanks in the UK. But it's not just the UK, it's not just the US, and it's interestingly not just a democratic problem. It's very clear that the Arab uprising swept away these types of klepto governments, only to see them replaced with very similar governments. You know, I don't know if that answers your question, but it gives you some examples of where that leads. Thank you for that question. Further questions, please? I thought this was vodka, sorry. It does say vodka on it, doesn't it? Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating speech, Professor Manners. I have a question regarding the new European Commission. The new president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that her commission is going to be the first geopolitical commission. Now, can the EU be at the same time geopolitical power and keep and retain its normative core?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think if you were to assume that normative power meant, as Zaki Laidi suggested, the ability to project your norms on others, what I would call norm power rather than normative power, then yeah, sure, the more the EU starts to look like a country, as Pew would have it, then the more it can take these really good norms that it's got and just convince other people around the world just how good they are. Now, that might work in theory, but I grew up in Malaysia, a country that had a lot of British norms enforced on it, and generally Malay people thought, just wait till we get rid of you, as will the rest of the world. If you push your ideas on others, no matter how good they are, no matter how green they are, no matter how pro-human rights, anti-death penalty they are, in the end, it feels an awful lot like imperialism. So you cannot engage in the act of normative power alone. Okay, that's not power, that's violence. Yeah? Even if it's introducing, look, just liberalize your state sector, let private contractors take over, and everything will work perfectly fine, and there won't be any state failures at all. That's not how a genuine act of solidarity at a global level works. I think the people demonstrating in the streets over climate change, over pro-migrants, refugees are welcome, over pro-EU, or other types of pro-transnational movements tell us a lot more about how the EU and other political organisations around the world need to listen and think than trying to mimic the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in the US. I mean, we did that. When I say we, I mean we European empires did that. We did that for 250 years, and it seemed to work really well. But in the end, it never works, right? Because everybody hates you forever. Yeah, and they're just sat there going, ha, 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 look at your empire decline. And Brexit is the end of empire for the UK. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you. How are we doing for time? Do we have time for another question? A question here, thank you. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm the Canadian ambassador.
Oh, hello.
Question for you with regards to a comment you made near the end of your remarks about the fact that parties on the left are increasingly not addressing the issues that are, in fact, of daily concern to citizens. And I wonder if you could just expand on why that is happening, in your opinion.
Great question. I think parties on the left have generally been co-opted by neoliberalism. As somebody who's witnessed many different so-called left-wing parties, it's a very real challenge. I think it's worth asking the question the other way around, right? What would a more planetary, politically aware world look like? What would a more ontologically secure planet look like? Why can't we achieve the types of goals and targets set out at the IPCC, at Kyoto, or in the case of Paris? Because neoliberalism has taught us not to see the things that are going to end this, right? And it's also taught parties of the left that they can embrace the market, they can embrace the privatization of public life, the privatization of utilities, the privatization of tar sands. And all they need is just a little bit of redistribution to fix it, And now, in other political systems, so-called socialists in the US, give or take a heart attack, in the UK, give or take losing the next election, seem to think that taking neoliberalism and sprinkling with a bit of public ownership will fix it. But we absolutely don't see what we're doing and how we're ignoring the genuine concerns of the planet and the people on it. And current left-wing parties don't see that either. Their hunt for power, the basically assimilating the technologies and strategies of centre and centre-right parties undermines all democracy. If you were actually a conservative party, you'd want a healthy left-wing government or left-wing party, because without it, all you're doing all the time, and we see this in Denmark, is fighting parties to your right. So, the ultra-nationalist, quite racist, xenophobic Danish People's Party, this time round in the elections lost power because there were two more parties to the right of them, I mean, how unimaginable is that, right? They weren't even nasty enough, you know. No, get rid of all foreigners, throw all Muslims out of the country, wasn't nasty enough, yeah? So if there's no genuine voice, if there's no genuine position, no genuine concern on the left, parties in the centre and the centre-right just keep on moving further and further to the right. And that's a failure of democracy and a failure of liberalism itself. Thank you for the question.
Just one quick question. You're not Danish, but you live in Denmark, and Denmark has been a pioneer of opt-outs from EU. So it has voted not to be solidar on a number of issues. So how do you balance the return to sovereignty debate, not just in Denmark, Sweden, that has been a pioneer of solidarity, it has also brought back these debates, and not to mention our region where we didn't go over the traditional sovereignty concept towards solidarity.
Yeah. I think what's happened in the EU, certainly since the Single European Act, has been a delinking of who the EU is for and then what EU reforms have done. Delors suggested there must be a single European market and there needs to be a social Europe. You can't have one without the other. If you do, you sow the seeds of your own defeat. Political systems work because they bring together politics, society, economics in a collective act of agreement. Countries that didn't like this solution of separating the social, the welfare state and keeping it at the national level, as in Denmark, asked for a series of opt-outs. They were granted it by Helmut Kohl, no other reason, right? No Helmut Kohl, no Danish opt-outs. But Denmark has 4 opt-outs, one of them on the euro, one on defence, one on justice and home affairs. The UK has 2 opt-outs on the euro and on Schengen, as well as a special position on justice and home affairs, which it'll never achieve again. There are other countries, the Czech Republic, Poland, and to a certain extent Sweden, who opt out of certain aspects. And everybody who doesn't join the euro opt out by not fulfilling the Maastricht criteria for joining the euro. So there's incredible variation across the EU on this question. Is it a lack of solidarity? Yes, ultimately, and in the end it kills you, right? So in Sweden didn't join the euro, so it has unbelievably low interest rates in order to stop hot money coming into the country because it's not in the flat eurozone, right? And so its economy is going in terrible trouble. Denmark didn't join the euro, but has used a euro peg since 1984, and it cannot set any own interest rates other than trying to match the euro peg forever. So the whole central bank spends all its time, 24 hours a day, matching the peg. That's the job of the central bank, you know. And so when it goes up, when it goes down, and pressure forces it in the other way, so it has to spend all its foreign reserves, or it has to quickly spend krona and buy foreign reserves. Well, these aren't independent financial or monetary policies. This is slavery on a grand scale. The Eurozone clearly doesn't work in the way in which it separates an adherence to fighting inflation when there is no inflation, and a lack of solidarity with countries that suffer significant financial and monetary imbalances like Greece and other members of the Eurozone. But this all comes back to the same problem. If you think you can delink politics, economics, and society, concern for everyone within the EU and everyone without the EU, as if these are separate policy fields, thinking what I would call reductionist in a way, or an atomistic way, you really are failing to present an adequate perspective on what the EU is and should and must be. And that doesn't mean to say everything must go to the EU level, but there must be a concerted conversation about where it should be. And Brexit, again, has spawned a series of movements that demand change. You know, the broad-based Labour left today, socialist Labour left today, broadly supports reform of the EU to address exactly these issues rather than leaving the EU. There's only certain small cliques within the Labour Party and academics who serve far-right interests outside of the Labour Party that advocate leaving the EU and embracing disaster capitalism. And that's my short answer. Thank you very much. Oh. Okay. The representative ambassador would like to speak first, okay. And then the cameraman would like a question.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Don't you think that liberalism, neoliberalism, is not actually the basis of populism? and going back to nice old times where borders were borders, is actually the worst enemy of this. Free movement of people, capitals, goods. That's exactly what liberalism is devoted to. And I think that it's exactly a reaction to that, and not based on that the reaction of populism comes. Going back to the nice old times when everything was greater, borders were really borders, people stayed where they were born. I'm not sure that, I'm not convinced by this connection you made.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it would be nice to say that, wouldn't it? That liberalism is about freedom and freedom of movement, and that it's difficult to disjoin that from neoliberalism. But neoliberalism isn't about freedom and freedom of movement, it's about ownership. Yeah? Who owns you? Who gets to sponsor everything? Who gets to shape the public debate? Who gets to publish? Who gets to print? Who gets the media? Who owns social media? All of this is neoliberal. Yeah? There's no chance for functioning democracies with Facebook and Twitter and other social forums not taking a position on whether to censor or involve or regulate public debate in democracies. Democracies are dead if this continues on. That's nothing to do with freedom of movement, freedom of ownership, freedom of consumption, okay? Now, there's an interplay, of course, which is that neoliberalism shapes the culture through which we live our lives and the way in which we want more and more and more. We want to travel more and we want to purchase more, and everything that we bought last year has to be thrown away this year because we need even more new stuff. And that's an addiction, okay? But I think you have to go very, very, very careful on trying to support broad-based liberalism and suggest that you can't separate it from neoliberalism. The question of ownership. In a functioning, genuinely liberal democracy, there would be a balance struck. Liberals strike a balance between collective needs and private needs. Yeah? And so I think the question is where does that balance lay in history today? And I think it's moved quite a lot to the right. I won't address the question of populism, but I just want to address that very specific question.
I will have to ask the media to give interviews after the session because we're late. No, I know, but we'll have to move with the agenda so you can get an interview after. Yes. Okay, Mike.
Quick question, tough answer. Can you say something about democracy and the proposal to buy Greenland?
What a great question. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, in a way, this addresses the question here, right? If Greenland is for Greenland people, then obviously it's not for sale, right? Thank you. But you know what? If everything is for sale, then tough luck. Denmark will sell Greenland as it sold previous islands. Okay, you know, and you can think about this is what empires do, right? So, yeah, and this, of course, is why, you know, one of the world's leading, most rampant neoliberals who serves the interests of corporate and no other, the 45th, was so keen and thought it would be perfectly all right to try and buy Greenland so that he can then own, of course, you know, the Arctic for the next 5 years, and then it ceases to exist. Greenland would be, you know, I think Denmark would be kind of keen to sell Greenland because obviously it's going to suffer from 65,000 climate change refugees in the next 20 to 25 years fleeing Greenland back to Denmark. So it's a win-win situation in sort of neoliberal terms, but in genuine liberal terms, it's up to the people of Greenland to decide what goes on in their life, you know, and that's how democracy works. So thanks for your question.
Thank you.